Have Chelsea blown their season, or can Liam Rosenior get them back to where they need to be? Well, to get into this, we've got JJ Bull, Alex Barker, and Liam Twomey. Liam, let's start with you on this one, because Rosenior used some serious language. He says they have set fire to 4 points in recent weeks. What's the feeling with the club, amongst the fans in particular, about the direction that Rosenior's taken this club?
Well, there were boos at the final whistle against Burnley. I think that was a visceral reaction to the timing of the equaliser, the way it went in, the fact that Chelsea then nearly lost the game to a virtually identical corner a couple of minutes later. The frustration, I think, coming from the stands is more at a sense of where Chelsea are going, where their season is going, and not so much on Rosenior, who I think has obviously not been there very long and has actually had his name sung a couple of times after wins. But there is a lot of frustration and a real sense of urgency about the situation that Chelsea are in as they look to try to make sure that they're still a Champions League club next year.
Yeah, but what about on the pitch in particular? Since Rosenior's taken over, have Chelsea got better?
Kind of the same. So if you look at the numbers, what you have is there's not a huge amount of differences. It is important to look at the games they played against, because the teams they played against, 2 of them are in the relegation zone, 2 of them are very close to it, and 1 of them is Brentford. But if you look at the actual numbers, what they have done is created more XG in open play, but they're also playing the teams who are going to get relegated, so you'd hope that would be the case anyway. What they are also doing was a weird one, is that they're generating fewer shots, but they've got a higher shot conversion rate, so maybe they're getting better quality chances. But there's not a huge amount of difference really in what's happened. And it's because Liam Rosenior is learning about the players. He's learning about the people you can lean on when things aren't going your way. You need to see a game out. That's something we need to address very quickly. And I think he's referring specifically to players not doing their jobs, like set piece marking, which is one of the things he talked about in the Burnley game, wasn't it?
Yes, yeah. Missed assignments.
Missed assignments. So he's learning people who know to do the assignment. Also, he's learning which players keep getting sent off because they keep playing with 10 men, which is not ideal. And it's harder to defend against any team in the Premier League. Every game's a hard game in the Premier League, but like Burnley, again, 10 men, so they have to defend for the last 20 minutes of it with 10 men. Like Liam said, so Chelsea have dropped 4 points in recent weeks under Rosenior, but in this season they are joint second worst for that. They've conceded 19 points from winning positions, which is obviously not what a champion would do.
At all.
But they've got a very young squad. Would you say inexperience is part of this, Liam?
Chelsea get annoyed when that comes up. It gets brought up a lot, obviously, given the average age of the squad. What you can say is I think there are certain failures of kind of game IQ and game management.
Well, let's say, like, is it tactics or is it individual players? I would say a lot of the things are individual errors by players, which a manager can't really manage, but you can also manage them by not having them there. Does that make sense?
Well, the one thing you could say with regards to the Burnley game in particular is that maybe in turning to his bench and bringing on all of the tall people, which is what Rosenior did in the final 20 minutes when they were down to 10 men, you end up manifesting the set-piece barrage from James Ward-Prowse that you're actually worried about, because they finished the match with 4 centre-backs on the pitch. And when you do that, you naturally drop deeper. It gives Burnley an opportunity to put the ball wide, high, get deflections for corners, and then of course James Ward-Prowse can do his thing. So that's the one thing.
Going to happen, right? Because if you're 10 men anyway, you don't want to try and drop too deep. Also, you know that James Ward-Prowse is going to start launching catapults into the box. So maybe that's a good way to defend against it.
Yeah, well, the only 2 ways really are to do what Rosenior did, or to try to make sure that you're playing with the ball enough and high up the pitch enough that you don't give away corners in the first place. But that's difficult with 10 men.
Exactly.
But, yeah, it's a bad situation that they repeatedly get put in because of how many players they get sent off.
And as we've said, he's learning. But what else have we learned about Rosenior? Well, we can look at what his team does. There's a few changes he's made, not a huge amount of differences, just basically in the basic shape things that he's done. Reece James is not a midfielder anymore, really, so what he's doing is playing more as a right back. Because what you saw a lot under Maresca was a lot of inverting fullback. So Reece James would often invert into here, you'd have a midfielder like Caicedo normally, and then this other midfielder would jump up here, so you get a bit of a box. But that's not what they're doing now. Now he's trying to build up with a different kind of 3-2, and that looks a bit like this. You split the centre-backs really far and wide, because obviously if you're trying to press against them with a narrow 2 like most teams do, well, that's kind of harder to do if they're really spread out. And you bring up this guy forward, and then you pull your central midfielders kind of in, and you push your fullbacks higher up. So you end up with a different kind of shape, but you get a different 3-2. The goalkeeper's really involved. Did this a lot at Strasbourg, I think, Alex?
Yeah, definitely with Andre Santos, who's come into the team right under Rosenior. I mean, he was Ligue 1 Young Player of the Year when he was playing under him at Strasbourg. I definitely think, like, from what I've noticed watching Chelsea, maybe I'm too Ligue 1 pilled, but he knows the structure pretty well that, like JJ's outlined here, that Rosenior's tried to bring in. And what you see with Santos, he quite often drops in here and he's like looking already behind him, scanning behind him, receives the ball and is already pinging it straight out to the fullback, or I think it was against Leeds in the build-up to the goal. I think it was like Palmer or someone just ahead. He receives the ball, is turning immediately, knows where he's going to fire it in. Like, you've definitely seen, a bit more Strasbourg in there, and I think that's Santos is pretty emblematic of that.
This is one of the main differences. I think under Maresca, what you saw is they'd get to the final third, we talked about this quite a lot, and then it would slow down and get quite boring because they had control. But there's a little bit less of that with Rosenior. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, and that's what he said after Burnley. He basically criticised his players for being too safe in possession after they scored early on, and he said, I want incision every time we have the ball. And I mean, Burnley was certainly part of that story, because when they got played through for the first goal, which was exactly the kind of move you're talking about.
Oh, should we look at it?
Yeah, it was exactly what you've drawn up on the tactics board.
Well, let's go through it. This is the back three, right? So you bring the goalkeeper forward. It becomes a back four when you drop one of the central midfielders into there as well. So it could be a 4 or a 3. But either way, the goalkeeper is really essential for how they want to play. Then you can see there's 2 central midfielders who are further forward. There would only be one because it'd be joined by a fullback normally, which then gives you options further wide because there's fullbacks. And then what you can do is you can drop the midfielders slightly deeper. So like Enzo Fernandez will drop in to try and receive where the space is. He'll pull out wide. That's where the space is. That's what you get. Other players will do this. They have the players who are in the front line will drop in to receive. It's so they can play through the opponent, basically. And there you see Reece James. The reason he's highlighted is because he's a fullback who's higher up. Normally he'd be in the middle. When he's further up, he can then either, it allows you to stretch the pitch, means wingers can drop in, forwards can drop in. Just gives you loads of options. It's just a bit of rotation. That's what we see, and that's where he'd normally be. I've got that circled there. Now, if we look at the actual goal, exactly what Liam has just mentioned, I was prepared. I knew he would say it. Here is Alex's favourite on the ball, Andre Santos. Look how far and wide Fofana is over here. I think there's Fofana there on the centre back, right? So he's really far and wide. You see Caicedo's right next to him. You've got Gusto as the left back over there. So then when he fires this ball through the press, because they're constantly being stretched out, the front two, they become a 3 at times, Burnley, because we're trying to press them, not man to man, but just trying to block and play through, right? So once you get the ball through, Caicedo can turn. And then he gets the incision, if you want, exactly the word, right? So they can turn, goes, and then with one pass, he can split the entire of the Burnley ball. The Burnley ball?
The Burnley defence.
In one pass, he can destroy the Burnley defence. The entire team is gone. So you have more players at the back, the other team pushes more players forward to try and make sure they're not outnumbered by them. Therefore, when you play through them, well, you have another overload somewhere else. So that's what you get. So this is what you're getting from Rosenior, is like more direct attacks at time, but they still have the control. They're pressing in different ways, man to man. They're scoring lovely goals like this sort of one they scored here. And then again, you see Reece James creeping up on the right-hand side, far wide, rather than being in the middle, trying to dictate things. So there's a few differences he's played. Tactics and whatever is one part of it, but like West Ham, they were 2-0 down at half-time. And the changes they made at half-time was Cucurella came on, Garnacho came off, Jimmy Gittins was off earlier, I think.
Because he changed the whole left side.
Yeah, it's not about tactics so much as you have players on who have the energy, the aggression. Pedro came on and made the whole game different. So you bring on players like this, and sometimes they make the difference. It's not the tactics that you change, it's the individuals. And as Rosenior said, like sometimes tactics go out the windows in these situations, but he knows when to make the changes, he makes them early. That's a good thing, I think, for what you've seen. And the impact he's made has been difficult, because when you look at what Rosenior's calendar looks like, I actually broke into his phone and stole this. So this is what he has. Yes, he does have an iPhone. This is what you have. He signed his, well, he's announced on the 6th of January, right? And then he starts his new job. So if you imagine, like, after a game, you need to rest, right?
Yeah.
So normally a training schedule, you'd have rest or a really light recovery. If they go into the training ground, it would be like a short recovery session normally. Very minimal stuff. But he signs his contract, they lose to Fulham. The next day probably does introductions, probably has some hellos, some one-on-one meetings, like a normal job. That's what a manager does, right? And then you've got a day of probably light training because they're straight into another game. Then you have a rest. Then you've got Arsenal coming up, massive game. You can do video training, you can do a little bit of on-pitch stuff, but not too much because you're having to rest. And they've had these issues with like medical staff, like telling them what defenders can play here and when, and all these sorts of things as well. So you're trying to like manage all these things. You've got a game against Napoli, you've got a flight that day, so that's travel, really light session. Again, everything's super light. How do you make an impact in this sort of time? Very difficult.
little,
So I think the reason you're not seeing too much difference is probably because him and Maresca are kind of aligned probably anyway with a lot of things, and he doesn't need that much tweaking really. But he's having to manage the workload of the players, a huge busy schedule. He hasn't had time really in training ground to do an awful lot. Also, all their players keep getting sent off.
That's the perfect point to come to you, Alex, because discipline is really fascinating with this team. We saw a recent red card, again, for Chelsea against Burnley, but also leadership as well is another conversation. Are these two interlinked as to how we see sort of Chelsea moving at this moment in time?
Yeah, absolutely think so. I think it's definitely a criticism that gets thrown at Chelsea quite a bit, right? They're a very young team, so it's really easy to lay back and say, well, you know, they've not got the experience, that's why they make the mistakes. But what I wanted to do was take that argument and have a bit more of a forensic look at it and see how, you know, a perceived lack of experience, a lack of leadership, which I do think Chelsea have. So I wanted to look at how that might manifest on the pitch. So here I have a corner that Chelsea conceded late on against Aston Villa. We've already spoken about the one they conceded against Burnley, where there was a free man that nobody picked up. Kind of a similar thing happens here. You don't really need to be a genius to look at where the weakness might be. Here is Enzo Fernandez. Here is Amadou Onana, Konsa and Watkins all bundling on top of him. This is a clear weakness and nobody's taking responsibility to say, maybe we should try and address this. And Fernandez is clearly struggling, so much so he actually turns and tries to get someone to help out. He sees Badiashile at the near post, who's not going to come over. Worth saying at this point, Badiashile and Chalobah are playing together as a centre-back pairing. Remember those two for later. So Fernandez sees him, Badiashile isn't coming over, so he beckons Gusto over. So Gusto kind of hesitantly wanders over, goes, maybe I need to defend this and help him out. And as this is taking place, Villa take the corner. Chelsea are woefully unprepared for how to defend this. So when it comes in, complete chaos occurs and Watkins gets on the end of the corner and heads it straight in. So kind of a similar thing happened with Burnley. I think it's happened with a couple other Chelsea set pieces as well defensively, which might explain why they can be so good on the attacking end and they have a renowned set piece coach in Bernardo Cueva, who, by all accounts, is very good at what he does. But while he might be able to put the structure in, they don't have players taking enough responsibility and organising things defensively when other teams try new things to adapt. Another area I think that Chelsea are lacking leadership is a position I've actually praised on the pitch before is Moises Caicedo in defensive midfield. I was on the show with you and I said he's one of the best players in the world. I don't think enough people praise him. It's quite fun to do this exercise and watch Chelsea back, and not from a tactical point of view or what Caicedo can do on the ball, but like how he communicates with others. And it actually did make me think a bit more negatively of him. I think he comes across very quiet on the pitch, and I'll mention a bit more why in a second. But first of all, here's a goal that Napoli score against Chelsea. It's the second goal. Again, don't need to be a genius to see where the potential weakness is. Here is Elmas on the ball, and Oliveira, their left wing back, is going to make an underlapping run through this big space in behind. I think at this point, Caicedo should be looking at Esteval and either shouting at him, you've got a man on you, you need to track him, don't let him get in behind, or he takes
responsibility. Yeah.
Exactly, himself, and covers him. He kind of does neither, and Oliveira is just able to freely run into this space, gets the ball, crosses it in, and Højlund scores at the near post.
I actually remember on the TV footage of this game, the camera panned to Caicedo afterwards and he was looking over to the bench saying 2-on-1. It was a 2-on-1. But obviously the communication after the fact is not as valuable as the communication in the moment.
Maybe he's like looking at someone else to look it up. It's worth saying Reece James was kind of nearby there as well. Maybe he's thinking James should be taking leadership there. Maybe we'll talk about that in a second.
Yeah.
However, I think the worst offender for leadership is in the centre-back pairing when Wesley Fofana is not playing. And the game I want to highlight is Chelsea against West Ham when they go 2-0 down in the first half. We mentioned the subs earlier. The one name I was letting you forget who came off at half-time was Badiashile. He was playing alongside Chalobah. And these two as a centre-back pairing, and they defend and they play together like they hate each other. They just don't talk to each other. And there's a great example of it here, I think, where Bowen receives the ball in central midfield. This is Badiashile, this is Chalobah. He's going to move the ball out wide to Wan-Bissaka. And as this takes place, Castellanos is going to move from Chalobah. Chalobah's man marking him. And he's going to run into this space, into the channel. Again, it's quite obvious in hindsight where this is going. At this point, Chalobah, I think, needs to be making it very clear to Badiashile that Castellanos is making a run, you need to track him. He either does not make that communication or he doesn't make it clearly enough because Badiashile seems completely unaware of what's happening. And Castellanos gets a pretty big head start before he even starts chasing after him. He gets the ball down the line, the cross comes in and it gets cleared. It's quite a minor example, and I know all of these are minor examples, right? But I did want to look at Arsenal as a comparison and just to see how does the best defensive team in the league compare to what I'm seeing at Chelsea. And it makes the differences even more obvious. For one, I mentioned Caicedo earlier, comparing him to Declan Rice. Declan Rice is constantly organising others, especially at set pieces. He seems to take a really big responsibility of making sure there's not a single free player in the box and in open play as well, whereas Caicedo comparatively is very quiet. But also in the centre-back pairing, obviously Gabriel and Saliba, I think, intrinsically are probably better defenders than Chelsea's defenders, but also they're always communicating and making sure players aren't free. Again, a minor example of that is a counter-attack that Arsenal are conceding against Liverpool. This is Saliba, this is Timber. Here's Gakpo making a run in behind. Gakpo's going to try and pull wide. Saliba, he wants to stay in the middle, cover the centre-back space, and he shouts at Timber twice actually, I want to be here, you need to cover Gakpo and get into position. That's exactly what Timber does. He chases after him, gets his head down, so when the cross comes in, Saliba clears it. This doesn't even turn into a chance that would register on a data provider, right? I know, it's a very boring run of screenshots there, but that's kind of the point. This is nothing, but at Chelsea, this kind of turns into something because this sort of communication I don't think is happening enough. Which begs the question, if communication isn't happening, if players aren't taking up leadership responsibilities, who are Chelsea's leaders and what are they doing wrong? As we have discussed, Chelsea have a very young squad. I'm not sure if you knew that. Mikhailo Mudryk is the 8th oldest player in their team, and he literally cannot play football right now. There are a couple other players to mention as well, like Tosin, for example, probably, I think it's fair to say, the most vocal player.
Uncle Tosin.
Oh, there you go, right? I mean, probably the best leader, like vocally on the team, not the best footballer, so doesn't tend to play as much. I think it's fair to say Chelsea's real leaders here are Reece James, the captain, obvious, Enzo Fernandez, the vice-captain, obvious, and also Wesley Fofana, who I think is clearly the most vocal in the back line. But I think they all have their own issues. For example, Fofana, very good at organising the defence when he's in it, but he's a very aggressive player, right? Off the ball, he likes to step up and track players between the lines. And on it, he likes to carry the ball out. It's worth saying that Levi Colwill's obviously out injured at the moment. I've been speaking to an analyst called Connor Holden, who's pointed out to me that Colwill, despite being young, is pretty good at organising the back line himself. So when Fofana steps out, he can kind of take over. When Colwill isn't there and Fofana steps out, there's nobody left. Reece James is also an interesting one. I wanted to ask you about this because I think he has moments where he's vocal on the pitch at times, but also moments where he's a bit quiet. And I know Maresca's criticised his leadership before. I don't know is that something you felt as well?
Yeah, so Maresca called him out publicly quite early in his tenure at a time when Reece James was not playing hardly at all. And so it was clear that that criticism was more about the way Reece James was around the group and what Maresca expected from a captain off the pitch as well as on the pitch. And I do think since that point, James has really made an effort to grow into the role on the pitch and off the pitch. He's always been a more assertive presence in games than he is outside. But I think he is shouting to teammates more, directing things a bit more. The big problem, though, is he's still not on the pitch every game. So you don't have that consistent line of communication because he's being managed. You know, he's playing once, maybe twice a week and not playing the midweek game, which is now a Champions League game, not a Conference League game. So Chelsea don't have those lulls in their season where they can maybe get away without some of their leaders being on the pitch. And I think you also made a really good point about Colwill because last year, you mentioned Gabriel and Saliba, such a settled partnership. They understand each other implicitly. I think Colwill and Fofana were getting there and their games actually complemented each other quite well. You mentioned how aggressive Fofana is. Colwill could hang back a bit more as well and keep the game in front of him. And him not being there this season, I think Chelsea have had more centre-back pairings than any other team in the league.
Oh, wow.
That's part of the bigger rotation that's been going on that I think has been very divisive with fans. But at centre-back in particular, it's all about those relationships and that communication. And as soon as that's disrupted, I think in general, Trevor Chalobah has had good reviews for his performances individually, and he does consider himself and act like he's part of that leadership group off the pitch. But it's interesting the point you make about the communication on it.
I think I've got an example of the James and Fofana things we were just speaking about there, how like James might still be finding his feet right as a captain on the pitch due to him not being on the pitch all the time. So this is against Newcastle, you'll remember this, when Newcastle scored very early on. It's at St James's Park, Chelsea should be looking for control. Fofana receives the ball under a bit of pressure, but because he's great, he's going to take it past Anthony Gordon and get to this point. I think at this point, Fofana should be internally screaming, I need to get rid of the ball, keep possession, I'm way out of my position, and if we lose it, it's very bad. I think Reece James, who's right next to him, should also be thinking out loud, screaming at him, move the ball to me, I'll play it back, or get rid of the ball, we can't lose it here. Instead, James actually gets out of the way, Fofana continues dribbling to God knows where, and loses the ball, and surprise, Newcastle go on a counter-attack. And then you see this quite comedic thing where as Newcastle move forward, Fofana, who is the organiser in the back line, starts having to organise the back line from defensive midfield. And maybe it's no surprise then that Newcastle move the ball forward, get it into the box, and Voltemade ends up scoring. Now, the other player we mentioned before was Enzo Fernandez, the vice-captain. And I think he is a very good leader on the pitch. Definitely when Chelsea have the ball, you can see them guiding where the ball should go, where teammates should be. But there is another element to leadership, and that's setting an example, which is particularly important when you have a very young squad who should be looking up to your leaders. These guys are laughing because they can see what's about to be shown. Since August 2023, Enzo Fernandez picked up the most bookings in the Premier League for dissent, fighting. Not the best example, I think, from your vice-captain to be set. Maybe it's no surprise then that Chelsea are also top of the Premier League in this same time frame for yellows, way ahead as well. It's also quite interesting that them and Brighton, the two youngest teams in the league, are right at the top of the table for yellows, booking for dissent. Just quickly going back to this other table as well, it's quite funny that Cole Palmer and other Chelsea players right near the top, and Nicholas Jackson, who hasn't even played in the Premier League this season, is fifth, is ahead of other players.
The legend lives on of Jackson.
There was
honestly
a stretch when the PGMOL created the emphasis on clamping down on dissent, where Nicholas Jackson was literally getting a yellow card every single week because apparently the memo hadn't reached him.
I mean, it really does go to show like Chelsea's issues there, like with their discipline. I think another example, Moises Caicedo, maybe not the most vocal leader, but again, Chelsea's Player of the Year last year, should probably be leading by example, has picked up the most yellow cards in this time frame as well, just generally for whatever reason. So kind of begs the question, how do Chelsea solve this, right? Because you can either hope that these guys learn from their mistakes, grow into the leaders that you want them to be, and set a better example to the younger players coming through, and organise things better on the pitch. You also have Colwell coming back next season. Or you say, to hell with it, we need experience in. It's not just a buzzword, it actually means something on the football pitch. We need to abandon a recruitment policy. We need to get in older players. But it's a very small chance that Blueco do that, right?
Well, that's the bigger question. Are Blueco going to change their strategy? Because there is a simple fix here of buying players that have been in the trenches, maybe won stuff in that respect as well, and can offer that experience to this relatively younger squad.
I mean, when you talk to people at the club, there is always an insistence that there is not a hard and fast under-23 recruitment policy. It's not that as soon as a player has their 24th birthday, we're not interested in them anymore. There's always been the impression that if the right experienced player comes along for the right price, I mean, Tosin was obviously a very cheap one for them to pick up, he was a free agent, then they would look at it. And they did look at Virgil van Dijk, actually, as a free agent before he decided to re-sign with Liverpool. I'm not sure how realistic that ever was, but it did show you at least that they were prepared to countenance that possibility. I think they're looking for their top players to grow into leaders. There's also, I've been writing about Chelsea's disciplinary record for The Athletic this week, and there is a certain amount of it that is baked into their style of play. Given how aggressive they are, I think that's actually been ramped up under Rosenior compared to Maresca. They're pressing even more ferociously than they were all over the pitch. And so you are going to mistime some tackles, and when that happens, especially if you're going man-to-man a lot, if your man beats you, do you let him go or do you take a yellow? There's quite a lot of that going on. But when it comes to dissent and just generally arguments and things like this, time wasting as well. Chelsea have had quite a lot of yellows for time wasting over the last 3 years. This should be quite low-hanging fruit for Rosenior to address. And he made the point after Burnley that their disciplinary record under him, albeit very small sample size, has been better. It's far too early to say if that's a trend that we should trust.
Because he's learning.
And the men are ageing. That's the other key aspect of this.
But also, I mean, in this short period of time, is exactly what JJ said earlier in terms of, he's barely had much time with these players. I mean, you've got to look at it as a sample size and think, actually, you've come in at a point the club was in crisis, and actually you've steadied it to a certain degree, but what more can you expect from him?
Yeah, I mean, Chelsea have also had a pretty reasonable run of Premier League fixtures, which, as we've seen, they have not made the most out of in the last 2 games, and they have the hardest remaining Premier League fixtures left. So Rosenior's tests very firmly lie ahead, and I think even a month from now we may have a clearer idea of the impact that he's really had at Chelsea and the impact that he will have moving forward.
Can they do Champions League football, do you think?
Well, if you ask Opta's supercomputer,
hello.
They are now the likeliest of those 3 big clubs to finish 6th out of Liverpool, Manchester United. Manchester United, who've been actually the only team in the last 6 games that picked up more points than Chelsea, including wins over Manchester City and Arsenal. So they have an uphill challenge. They have to play the other 5 of the top 6 in their next 11 games. But the plus side of that is they can affect those teams' fortunes. If they want to catch Manchester United, they can actually make United drop points, and the same with Liverpool. But they also have to navigate the knockout stages of the Champions League, and they're still in the FA Cup as well. And this squad has not always proven the deepest in terms of quality when they've had to rotate between games.
On a financial level, though, how important is it to get into the Champions League next season?
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, Chelsea have already arguably left money on the table in the last couple of years by not having a front of shirt sponsor. They now have one until the end of the season.
End of the season, yeah.
No option to buy, we're told.
So the company's under 23 years old as well. So.
Yeah, exactly.
And the structural disadvantage of Stamford Bridge as well is something that they are always contending with. Until they solve the stadium issue, they consider themselves to be operating at a revenue deficit relative to some of their biggest rivals. That is partly why you see such a frenetic player trading operation going on, because they need to actually trade players profitably, not just break even, in order to make up for some of these other things. And if you don't have Champions League football, those pressures, those financial pressures from the top end just get bigger.
So, where do we genuinely think Chelsea will finish at the end of the season? Liam?
I think 6th, and the jury is out on how they do in the... I mean, they could finish 6th and win the Champions League, who knows?
I'm kind of torn because on one hand, I think you've written about this, Liam, right? With the hard fixtures, that might actually play into their hands. As JJ was showing earlier, the way Chelsea want to attack is going through the middle. And when you're playing against Burnley, who like in the second half just kind of said, all right, we'll sit in and not let you go through the middle, that's going to be something a lot of the weaker teams do, whereas the space might be there for the big teams. But they have kind of blown so many points away against the weaker teams already. So I think I agree with you in going 6th.
And JJ?
I don't know.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including David Ornstein, Amy Lawrence and James Horncastle. With the latest transfer news and insights on every Premier League story that matters, theathletic.com puts you inside football